Welcome. Today we begin the second half of this semester. And we're going to start with a change and an adaptation from a philosophy that you are a little bit familiar with, but it takes on an entire new character. This is now known as Neo Platonism. And while it will borrow ideas from Plato, the beginning of Neo Platonism doesn't start until after about 100 AD, and in many ways resembles more a religious adaptation of Plato's philosophy than a pure philosophical system. This is also going to allow it to kind of thrive amongst certain circles and then be adapted and changed once again and applied by people like Augustine and others. The casual reading of the history of philosophy is that it started off with those pre-Socratics hanging around Greece on either side, in Greece, Asia Minor, the islands in the Mediterranean, some over there in Italy. And they just are kind of postulating as to what the nature of the universe looks like, and they're the first ones to start thinking and questioning and trying to get an answer that isn't possibly just based in a religious conception of the universe. Possibly it is. Oftentimes it's overlapping. Then we have Socrates, and his explosion onto the scene kind of challenges and changes everything. We start to have rules and directions and an understanding as to what philosophy would be. This gets cemented with his student Plato in the founding of the academy. And then, of course, we have his student Aristotle, who then teaches Alexander the Great. And we now have this great explosion of learning. After that, the casual reading of the history of philosophy is that we kind of waited around, and we have new movements and religious ideology might start to trumpet and fight against the philosophical mindset and the way that that's going to go, and then we move into the Middle Ages, where there's this giant debate between philosophy of reason, and then we have the rediscovery of Aristotle, and then a shorter rediscovery of Plato, and then we get breaking down of this whole scholastic system and the emergence of the early modern period with people like Descartes and then Hume, Kant, etc. And then we get into modern philosophy. And this casual reading isn't so bad. It's got some aspects of truth to it. The problem is that we, in many ways, overstate the value of Plato and Aristotle during and immediately after their lifetime. Their impact was there during their life, but they weren't the only voices. And in many ways, their voices get muted before too long. We end up having two other systems that really took hold of Greek and later Roman thought. And this is Stoicism, founded by Zeno, and Epicureanism, founded by Epicurus. Now we'll notice from the dates of their lives that they were born before Aristotle died. Their philosophy might not have been mature, but they were there. They were on the scene. They were encountering these ideas, these people. And Stoicism and Epicureanism are philosophies of life. We could also add on things like cynicism. That is also here at this time as well. But all of these are useful. They address what happens in this life. They're not just speculative philosophy like we have with Plato and Aristotle, even though both would talk about politics and other practical concerns as well. Plato and Aristotle spoke of ethics being virtuous, but they didn't adequately, to a large number of Greeks and Romans, explain the ways to overcome the passions, those problems in their life. Virtue ethics sounds great, but it isn't a complete system. It's a guidepost, and it's a good guidepost. It's better than most would come up with, but it's not a complete system for your day-to-day life. Stoicism had a great champion later on in Rome with people like Marcus Aurelius, and we'll talk about him. And its main strength was it was the endurance that it would show you over the ills of this life. Epicureanism and later forms of hedonism, which grow out of it, the main strength was this sort of escapist quietism, both of which have values. And we'll talk about both of these later on in the semester as well, and their appeal to a lot of people. But both of these systems, Stoicism and Epicureanism, will fall flat when they encounter Christianity. And other than some moral applications, the legal ideas, they did little to advance medieval philosophy or theological thought, as would be the case with Plato and Aristotle. And so they get elevated a little bit more as a result of Christianity addressing both the metaphysical and practical concerns, and then being able to apply some philosophical lessons. Again, that doesn't mean there's not a large impact of Stoicism into Christianity and vice versa, and Epicureanism and some of these values and discussions. But those systems kind of just go away and become a philosophical footnote and get rediscovered in the 21st century with random books being written about them. And, oh, what keys can we take from them? There are some. There's some great keys to take from these philosophical, quasi-religious movements. But Stoicism and Epicureanism were too materialistic to survive the challenges of Christianity. Oddly enough, the very thing that gave them their advantage over Plato and Aristotle will become its downfall, because a new, stronger, material application system, that it being Christianity, will dominate the Mediterranean instead. Not all Platonists nor Aristotelians had waned in the onslaught of Stoicism and Epicureanism. There were still those who were attracted to the philosophy and thought there was value in Plato and others for Aristotle. We get a new rise in interest in metaphysics around the year 100. And there were these Platonists who looked at the religious elements of Plato and try to create a system around what was coherent. They're making a piecemeal attempt at creating a sort of religious identity out of Plato that could apply to your entire life in a sort of way of combating the Stoic and Epicurean, and later on the burgeoning Christianity, to try to address the issues of this life as well. The most important idea from these Middle Platonists, as they're often referred to, is the formation of what's known as the supreme principle, or the God who's on top of this hierarchy. Then the forms become the thoughts of this supreme principle. This was in part due to the incorporation of Pythagorean and Neo-Pythagorean thought into a Platonic system. So again, we're using different philosophers, but we're addressing a sort of metaphysic to try to address these, instead of just the practical concerns that Plato was really much more a part of. This supreme principle is then identified as the one, the Pythagorean label here, the first cause from Aristotle, and this is incorporated in there. And this is the first cause that will keep the universe going. Now, we'll see this first cause brought up later by people like Aquinas and his application of it. But Neoplatonism is the sort of synthesis of all of these ideas going on, Middle Platonism drawing from it, and Neoplatonism becomes the result of this sort of philosophical, metaphysical synthesis of ideas between Plato, Pythagoras, and Aristotle. At this point, Neoplatonism is really a religion. It takes not only Plato and a little bit of Aristotle and a bit of Pythagoras, but it starts to also incorporate forms of Gnosticism. Gnosticism, we saw a philosophical form out of Persia known as Manichaeism in our discussions of Augustine. But it's also this sort of quasi all over the Mediterranean idea that it has pagan forms, Christian forms, Jewish forms even, where there's this sort of cosmic duality between a good world of spirit and a bad world of matter. And we're starting to get some of this idea incorporated into Platonic thought as well. There's this push to avoid materialism, which is also facing some of those challenges of Stoicism and Epicureanism. So this is a valuable tool in Platonic thought surviving of it. The goal is now to meld yourself, your real identity, your soul, with the one. And that's done through practical concerns of avoiding the material world. There's claims that you need to purify yourself through reflection and contemplation over philosophical truths that exist in the realm of the forms, that is not with the body. And now you have a vision of the one. And that this becomes a sort of religion for philosophers as much as it is a philosophical system. The strength of Plato and Middle Platonism, it was still found in that Greek East, in Athens and in Alexandria. Oddly enough, they're the same places that Christianity is flourishing. And so we get this sort of contest between the Christian metaphysic and the Neo-Middle Platonic metaphysic. And which one is going to win the day and which one is going to be found to be supreme? This is the sort of discussion that's going to take place. Middle Platonism is also very much shaped by Christianity as it developed. A quick reading of philosophy by many who want to remain philosophers wants to kind of push it back the other way, as we see that Augustine drew from sort of Platonic thought, and therefore the first assumption is that Plato's before Christ, therefore Plato, Neoplatonism, impacted Christianity. But what we're going to see is that the religious attitudes that existed in Athens and in Alexandria and other places in the East where Christianity was flourishing the most in these city-urban philosophical centers, that was challenging and dominating Stoicism and Epicureanism, is also going to be shaping Neoplatonism. Now, of course, there is a back and forth. There is a, we'll face this challenge and we'll incorporate what seems good in order to defeat what we think doesn't work. But we have this sort of religious contest between what many people think of as just philosophical systems and the religious system of Christianity. There can be really no doubt that Neoplatonism is a religion when we look at the ideas of the supreme deity known as the One. The One is odd, to say nothing else of the One. In fact, you can't even say that the One is odd. That is technically incorrect. The only thing that you can say about the One is that it's the One, that it possesses oneness. The One surpasses all categories and therefore cannot even say that the One exists, because existence is a category. It's an idea postulated and placed onto the One. Fun to kind of push back here on Kierkegaard and these ideas of what is the change of coming into existence, of being. Does that predicate a change? For Neoplatonists, it kind of did. It adds another category of thought. The One only exists as the One. Nothing else. You can't say that the One is good or beautiful. You can't say that the One possesses all virtues. You can't say that the One is true. All you can say about the One is that it's the One, that it possesses oneness, that it's one. Now, it's believed that the spiritual world or the realm of ideas come from the One, but the One is not the creator of these. The One is simply the One, and they emanate from the One. But you cannot say that the One is the thing that things emanate from, because then you're going to say that the One is the source. And while the One is the source, you can't say that about the One, because the One is simply doing its oneness. It's just being one. The One is true and beautiful, but again, you can't say that the One is true or beautiful, because that would be adding another element to the One, who again, because the One surpasses all categories, it is outside of categorization and distinction. All you can say is that the One is one. If you add another category, if you want to say that the One is one and beautiful, now the One is no longer one, but the One is two, and of course two is not one. So we can't say that the One is true and beautiful, nor is it the source and font of all things, even though it is. It's not, because this would be adding things to the One, and now the One is 2, 3, 4, 5, and basic math tells you that 5 does not equal 1. So all we can say about the one is that it is one. The goal is a mystical union with this one. And notice again, this seems like a very religious idea, to be mystically united with this source of all life, with this one. And the way to do that becomes more philosophical speculation and this sort of Gnostic Platonic thought that's going to emerge. The two main leaders of Neoplatonism is Proclus, 412 to 485, who really develops the mature thought of Neoplatonism, and Plotinus, 205 to 270. He's really the big revolutionary leader. Now, it's really important that Plotinus does this at this time, because what's going to be the future is really in doubt in the 3rd century in the Roman Empire. There's just, if you were to look at the history of the Roman Empire, there's chaos all about. We have 20 different emperors seizing the throne, most of which are generals. We have the loss of silver mines. We've got just chaos all about. And this becomes the time when everyone is trying to find what can be held firm. Plotinus dies shortly before the rise of Diocletian, who settles everything down and then launches his great persecution of Christianity. But Plotinus is kind of giving the answer to how to have this Platonic thought, and is the real leader of Neoplatonism at this time. He ends up creating a system that's logical and spelled out. And he organizes Plato much better than Plato did himself. He reworks Plato, building up the parts that he thought were useful and kind of discarding the parts that caused too much problem. He incorporated some Aristotle to fill in the gaps when necessary, and is to Plato what a lot of people think Aquinas is to Aristotle. He's the one who formulates a rational conception that can apply into the broader world. It's him who ends up saying very clearly that the goal is love of the one. Now notice here he's being challenged and pushed by Christian circles that are existing around him, even though they're being persecuted and are not triumphant at all at this time. That will be another 50 years after Plotinus's death, roughly. And really the thought is a spiritual reality that Plotinus is pushing for. There's more of a stress on this divisions of form and matter, and Aristotle's potency and act, than the idea of just first mover. Right? So there's this larger push that's going to be brought in for Plotinus, and we're starting to really feel the religious philosophical aspect of Neoplatonic thought, of what Plato can do if we want to make it a religious system as well. Proclus is the one who spells everything out very clearly. He's sometimes referred to as Proclus of Athens. He is the head of the Platonic Academy in Athens for about 50 years. And so he's a great person to look to for what is Platonism and what are we going to do. He defined the superiority of the Hellenistic traditions of wisdom over Christianity. This was his push, this was his thought, that Athens is supreme over Jerusalem, to go with a debate between these cities and discussions that existed really throughout most of the Middle Ages of, what is the relation between Athens and Jerusalem? And Athens here for Proclus is superior. Now notice Proclus is born 412 to 485. This is his life. He lives after the Roman Empire, which includes Athens, converts over to Christianity. It's after the Council of Nicaea. He's after Julian the Apostate, who tried to pump up Neoplatonism. He's also after Emperor Theodosius, who said that if you're going to be a civil authority in the Roman Empire, you had to subscribe to the Council of Nicaea and be a Nicene Christian. So Proclus is, in many ways, the mirror of Plotinus. Plotinus was trying to form an argument that was kind of uncertain as to what the future is going to hold. Proclus is here trying to define mature thought before the whole system falls apart, and see what he can do to push and advance these ideas and maybe survive Neoplatonism. And in many ways, while Plotinus pushes much more this religious idea, Proclus kind of retreats it back to a little bit more philosophical ideas and the value of Hellenistic wisdom over what he thought was Christian wisdom. And we have this debate on this other side of the aisle now. Following Syrianus and Julian the Apostate, who kind of started the push before Proclus was even around, he continued in this sort of endeavor to create a synthesis of ancient Greek religious revelations, Homer and the various oracles, and the philosophy of Pythagoras and Plato. He has this big push and divide to try to help explain everything. And again, it's this sort of last gasp of religious philosophical idea as much as anything else. And we see here the basic division of how things look, the form of religious life, from the one and the emanations that come from the one, the spheres that will emanate from that intellect and this idea of a world soul that then finds place in matter and in your individual souls in the sensible world is this debate and discussion between this. This is where the Platonic forms exist. And then our knowledge goes back to the agent intellect, or eventually, ideally, to the one. And we have this philosophical idea about how these ideas move and relate to us and how we are to relate to ideas and the realm of ideas. The thing that becomes taken for granted by Anselm is the form of Neoplatonism without the religious identity. It's the idea that the forms, the Platonic forms, the realm of ideas exist, even if there is not an agent intellect, which will be discussed by other scholastic thinkers as well. Proclus wrote many tracts to try to help explain his philosophy, his theology. Many are lost, and many were never published. We just know that they were there, and they were kind of written and passed around. We have 5 commentaries on Plato, 1 commentary on Euclid. We have the elements of physics, the elements of theology, also known as his metaphysics, hypostasis of astronomical work, monographs on providence, fate, free will, and the origin of evil. Again, we're going to see very similar thoughts to many of the theological works that are done by Augustine and other prominent theologians, because philosophy and theology are not so easily divided here. The theos, the who is the God, becomes maybe an issue of division and what that looks like, but while we had a narrowing of what philosophy was into the realms of politics and ethics, we're now again broadening that back out and including metaphysics after about the year 100, trying to explain why we're here and what we're doing. And we have this by people like Proclus making this sort of discussion as well. He even has several hymns to the one in these theological tracts as well. Proclus's speech on happiness, he tries to set out and prove that he's reached this culmination of happiness, eudaimonia, borrowing this from Aristotle, and wisdom, because he ascended in all of the virtues, the natural, the ethical, the political, the purifying, intellectual, and what's known as the theurgetic virtues, which makes human acts the acts of the God. And we have this idea that you want to be happy, you want to thrive in a complete life. You're going to have all of these virtues brought in. That it starts off with just natural base virtues, and then will eventually be the acts of the gods wrapped up in this as well. What's interesting to note is the development of Platonic theology into what becomes known as the Triads. The Christian Trinity was already spelled out, already defined in the Council of Nicaea by the time we have Proclus, was clarified in the Council of Constantinople, was even addressed in the Third Council before Proclus was even born, the Council of Ephesus in 410. We have this spelled out existing notion of triunity. We also have people like St. Irenaeus who will speak to the sort of triunity of the self. We have Dionysius in his philosophy relating the intellect, the soul, and God, and the body, and this discussion, and a triad set up by Dionysius as well at this point. We also have the connection of philosophical thought and theology explained through Justin Martyr, or Justin the Philosopher, however one wants to define it, well before we have Plotinus. Plotinus is using the strengths he sees in Christian theology and philosophy and maturing Platonic thought in light of this. And so we have this new Platonic trinity of sort taking place. Most of these aren't even defined until the 3rd to the 5th century, until the time of Proclus. There's also addressed there's 3 hypostases in people. We have the self-subsistent entities of the one, the intellect, and the soul. And then becomes this question of why do we have matter? What's the value of matter? Matter becomes this sort of, again, important discussion for Manichaeans in addressing why there's evil in the world. And for Neo Platonists, they're taking on the question of matter as a sort of trick thing, that it's an issue of debate. Some say it's due to this fall and sin, very much borrowing from Gnosticism, ideas that we see evident in Manichaeanism. Others as an outgrowth of the intellect wanting to experience or understand less intelligible things. And there's this debate on the issues of matter. We have a second triad that also exists, this intelligible one, ontological levels of what things are, right? The intelligible being, the noetion, this is the object of the intellectual intuition. The intellective, the neuron, that is the intelligizing. And something between this, an intermediary level, that which is being intelligized and intelligizing, right? So we have the intuition, we have the object, we have the subject, and we have the relation between the two. Again, we're very much borrowing from other philosophical and religious systems to address this, and they're going to kind of play off of each other, and these will help move and shape later medieval thought as it's relating back to Platonic thought as well. We have a third triad also in existence, being, life, and intellect. And we see how this mirrors the sort of relation of the divine mind, the world soul, the sensible world, and ultimately the one. And this relation between all of them back and forth. The 3 ontological levels correspond to the triad of being, life, and intellect, and they play out the Platonic universe and a form of creation, explains how we're here. The world emanates from the one, and that's how everything works. And there's another triad to help explain how this works. The unparticipated, the participated, and the participating. From the Elements of Theology 23, we read, one that is not much as to the participated in by anything to which the participated entities, the one that are participated in by something and are connected by means of the triad of triads. So there's another triad, a triad of triads that connects all of these things in this relation of those things that are not participated, those that are doing the participating on, and the agent that is the participating. right? So again, this relation, the triad of triads, is the relation between being, life, and intellect. It unites cause and effect. Specifically, another of these triads are eminence, procession, and reversion from the Elements of Theology 35. Here we see the main metaphysical structure of the Platonic universe. The forms, or life, emanate from the one, and then they proceed into matter, or being, and in thought, the intellect, which then reverts back towards the structures which create them. We are drawn back to the one. We are drawn back to the source, like salmon returning back to the same stream so that they will spawned. It's the same sort of idea where we've got this eternal callback to the one that we were created from. Every effect remains in its cause, proceeds from it, and reverts upon it. There's always this return to the cause from the effect. For if it should remain without procession or reversion, it would be without distinction from, and therefore identical with its cause, since distinction implies procession. And if it should proceed without reversion or eminence in the cause, it would be without conjunction or sympathy with its cause, since it would have no communication with it. So we're having this relation back to our cause, and this becomes our communication with it. This is what draws our intellect in and helps us to think, is this desire to move back to the one. This is what keeps us from just being base material objects. And if it should revert without eminence in the cause or procession, how can that which is not received its being from the higher revert existentially upon the principle, thus alien, right? How can we relate to this? Again, this comes from the Elements of Theology, section 35. And this is the goal of what we're wanting to do. This develops a sort of Platonic theology. The way that we're going to understand the theos here is the one. And this was his commentaries on Plato. He ends up developing this further beyond just his Elements of Theology. He largely worked on making sure that we can understand the God in this respect. This is the move, this is the goal, this is what we are trying to do. This is the triads being used here. And we'll notice that there could be some very easy similarities between these triads and even people as far away philosophically as Kant, where instead of the one we might have the noumena, and then we have the procession, the noumena, the phenomena out of the noumena, and then we have our thoughts, our minds connecting to it, right? The same basic triad sort of system, instead of being the creation of the universe for Plato, is our understanding of the object itself. Kind of goes back to this Platonic triad, Neo-Platonic ideas of the forms relating to it, even though it's not exactly the same. We have this strong push and impulse within notions of philosophy of how do we relate the object, the unparticipating object, with ourselves through the act of participation? How do we understand the eminence and the procession from that, and are then putting our ideas onto this reversion? For Proclus, this was a giant theological playing out of creation and our own individual quasi-intellectual or spiritual reality of what we do to revert back and try to get mystical union with this one. For Kant, it's relating of the idea and how we're going to be there. And for much of philosophy, it's borrowing this form and adapting it in one way or another. And so Neoplatonism, while it's borrowing from many of these ideas that exist from other people, other sources, becomes part of the way that we just see the world around us working. While Proclus and his Elements of Platonic Theology show mature Neoplatonic thought, It's also those sorts of last gasps of what is Platonism and what's going to move forward. It's good to look back at Plotinus, which is an earlier source to understanding maybe a more pure Neoplatonic thought, one that is not as reactionary to Christianity, although it still is in at least dialogue with. It's on a much more even footing during the time of Plotinus, if not given political and social preference. So if we look at his Eneids, we can understand a little bit of his conception of the cosmos or the heavenly system. He states in the first tractate that we hold that the ordered universe in this material mass has existed forever and will forever endure. So this addresses any sort of temporal concerns about needing a creator god or anything else, that we have an eternal universe according to Plotinus. Every living thing is a combination of soul and body. Again, between the idea of intellect and matter, this division. How could anything once placed within a soul break away from it into non-being, becomes its question. No outside body is necessary to the heavens to endure in their permanence. So this becomes the sort of division that we're going to have here, that everything is made up of body and soul, of being and intellect, of matter and form, and the universe is eternal. This is the basic frame of the cosmos. And there are questions as far as notions of permanence and how this goes moving forward. In the second tractate, he further explains some of this in addressing the way our life works. He says, for every human being is of a twofold character, that there is a compromised total and there is an authentic man. There is this relation between the two. And here we're going to see a very similar idea to Hegel, the idea of having two parts to our self-consciousness, right? The master-slave dialectic is played out once again in this sort of Platonic realm. But here the difference is rational and irrational. The body, the animal mind, and the soul, and the mind that is subservient to the soul, as understood here by Plotinus. This is further defined in this sort of distinction that we're going to have, this compromised total in the authentic man. The soulless parts of all are merely instruments. All of their action is effected, so to speak, under a compulsion from outside of themselves. The souled falls into two classes, the haphazard and the driver. And again, we can very much see the ideas of Hegel borrowing from this as well with his master-slave dialectic, right? The one kind has a motion of its own, but haphazard, like that of horses between the shafts. But before their driver sets the course, they are set right by the whip, is what he says. In the living being possessed that of reason, the nature principle includes the driver, where the driver is intellect. It takes in the main a straight path to set end. But both classes are members of the all and cooperate towards the general purpose. You have your irrational part, your compromised total, your body parts, essentially. And then you have your reasoned parts, your intellect, which guides it and moves it to where it needs to go. The contribution towards the life and the whole consists in acting and not being acted upon. To go to Hegel, right, the master decides and dictates what's going to be, not the slave who is just the object of reflection. All living things, continuing on, he says, then are in the heavens, and all elsewhere fall under the general principle of the all, underneath all of this, right? They have been made parts with view to the whole, and there is no power that can wrest anything outside of them, outside of its distinctive nature. We're completing a sort of circuit of our soul in this relation to everything. Continuing on the discussion of the soul, he says, for certainty we cannot think of the soul as a thing, whose nature is just the sum of impressions from outside of it, That this is not what the intellect is. It's not just impressions from something outside. There is something internal. So if we're going to advance our discussion of 1,000 or so years between Hume and Descartes, we can kind of see where we're going to be siding is not with Hume, right? That there is going to be something that takes something in. There is this object which weighs out things. We have notions of apprehension in all likelihood, right? That it says there's something that's not just a sum of impressions from outside alone of all that exists and has no native character. There is something that has a character and a value to it. No, much more than all else, he says, the soul possessing the idea which belongs to the principle must have as its native wealth many powers serving to the activities of its kind. It is an essential existent, and with its existence must go desire and act and the tendency towards some good. We must be drawn to and pushed towards some other good because we have at least some nature of what it is to be man, this notion of soul, depending on who we want to end up arguing Plotinus with in this moment. While body and soul stand one combined thing, there is a joint nature, a definite entity having definite functions and employments. But as soon as any soul is detached, its employments are kept apart, its very own. It ceases to take the body's concerns into itself. It has a vision now. Body and soul stand widely apart, so they can be together, but upon death or anything else, they're separated. Another view will make the soul answerable for all and thus comes about, since the first creations have set up the entire enchantment. The soul is the intellect. It is the driving power of the body, and therefore it's the responsible one because it's the one that makes these moves, that it's pre-existent and not simply the product of observations, that there's some innate quality that exists as well, and that this, if we're going to apply it to Bonaventure and Descartes and many others, becomes the source of apprehension. This is not what's being argued, but this is where we can move our arguments from. Finally, he says, but these reason principles contained in the soul, are they thoughts? So now we're actually going to, do you have thoughts, and where do thoughts come from, and how is this going to apply? He says, it is upon matter that this act of reason is exercised, and what acts physically is not an intellectual operation or a vision, but a power modifying matter, right? There's this power that's within us, this soul, that changes the material world. Not consciousness of it, but merely acting upon it. The reason principle, in other words, acts much more like a force producing a figure or a pattern upon the water, that of a circle. Suppose where the formation of a ring is conditioned by something distinct from the force itself. And here we would think of notions of gravity and fluid mechanics and all sorts of other ideas of when you drop something into a water, those ripples that go out, that ring. Why is it in a ring? Why not a line? Why not anything else? That there's some sort of inference. And this is the idea that the thoughts have these creations that come out of the soul impacting material objects. That calculation here implies a sort of reference to something outside of it, something also contained within itself. Right? Reference then is to something outside or to something contained within itself. We must have a source for this. If it's of its own content, he says there's no need of reasoning, which could not itself perform the act of creation. Creation is the operation of that phase of the soul which contains ideal principles, and for that its stronger pursuance, its creative part. It creates then on the model of the ideas. For what it has received from the intellectual principle, it must pass on in turn. That it must have something on its own. And here again, we can tease out an idea of Kierkegaard a little bit of these ideas and where they come from. What difference does an idea coming into to matter, the existence of it? Is this a change or not? And how is this formulated and where is this going to go? Again, different ideas throughout the different eras that are still kind of playing off of this sort of Platonic framework, or at least relating to it and tangential to it. So today we talked about that influential system of Neoplatonism, the relation of Plato's thought into a wider philosophical and theological landscape, one that tried to survive the material concerns laid against Plato and Aristotle by other materialistic philosophies like Stoicism and Epicureanism, and later on Christianity. Neoplatonism survives by drawing out what it can from every other system. And later it'll kind of slowly peter out as Christianity's ascendant and the good parts of Neoplatonism are incorporated into later philosophical thought. The one makes way to God. The triads are seen as different triunities and triads of thought that are matured in thought, at least in some way, through Dionysius instead of Proclus. In fact, the relation between the two is one hotly debated. And where we're going to move in medieval thought is as a result of this debate of Platonic forms and the relation of it. It's very influential not only in the West, but also in Arabic philosophy as it moves through the era. Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Averroes, etc. are all using this Neoplatonic idea as one of their starting points, even while incorporating notions of Aristotle. So it's important to understand and to briefly mention some of what makes Neoplatonism Neoplatonism, understanding the notion of the one, that we can't say anything about the one, and also understanding that it's a reactionary philosophical movement. It's not just speculation, but it's trying to have an idea survive. And it's from Plotinus that we understand Plato better. He kind of purifies and rationalizes Platonic thought, even though he's also theologicizing it. That's not a word, but you know what I'm saying, in the same way.